Ah yes, the Chinese Empire, the center of human civilization and cultural development. For thousands upon thousands of years, the people of China have been the driving force behind the global economy, and some of the most important technological innovations like paper, gunpowder, and printing. In the eyes of the Chinese, their nation wasn't an important part of the global community, but quite literally, civilization itself. You might call that delusion or main character syndrome, but in all honesty, they had some really good reasons to believe those things. Ever since ancient times, China has controlled a massive portion of the global population and economy. They also had the most powerful and well-trained military in the world, and it was practically impossible to win a war against them. Well, with one very notable exception, but that's a story for another day. But this idea China had of itself was about to get shattered. During this time, Japan and Europe industrialized. Japan in particular went from an impoverished agrarian society to a modern European-style nation with a very capable military in just a few decades. On the other hand, China did basically nothing. They just pretended like everything was fine and chose to embrace tradition. As you can probably guess by the title of the video, that wasn't a very wise choice, and for the next 100 years, China saw its cities being burned, its people killed, and was forced to sign a large number of unequal treaties that humiliated the once great nation. Let's begin by breaking down this period of history into three distinct parts. The first one is the initial realization. As all bad things do in life, this story also begins with the British. At that time, Britain was hooked on Chinese tea. While the stereotype might sound a little ridiculous nowadays, at that time it was kind of true. Britain was spending as much as 5% of its GDP on tea imports alone, but that created a massive problem for them. China only accepted silver as a form of payment. At the same time, nations in South America were declaring independence from Spain, which meant that the worldwide supply of silver drastically decreased in just a few years. Suddenly, the British had to pay ridiculous amounts of money just to keep buying tea from China, which nearly ended up bankrupting the world's largest economy. So knowing all that, what do you guys think the British decided to do to solve this issue? Option number 1, make better products the Chinese actually wanted to buy. Option 2, open up more silver mines all around the world to increase the global supply. Option 3, stop importing so much fucking tea. Or option number 4, kickstart the largest drug trafficking operation in human history, which makes even Pablo Escobar's empire look like a candy shop. I think you can probably guess which choice they ended up making. The British started the production of opium in India, then using various Chinese smugglers, they would sell the drug all over the Qing dynasty. And while you might call that immoral or very irresponsible, I personally like to call it a money printing machine. Okay, I am joking, but regardless, the opium trade was extremely profitable for the British Empire. It's estimated that as much as 10% of the entire Chinese population was addicted to this drug. In all honesty, this number should come to you as no surprise. Life in rural China back then used to be extremely difficult, so a large share of the population resorted to extreme measures to avoid dealing with the brutal reality of their lives. The Chinese officials, realizing that a foreign power suddenly turned their population into drug-addicted junkies, was furious, so the emperor took immediate action and sent this guy to deal with the problem, and he was extremely effective. He executed thousands of illegal smugglers, he captured and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium, and drastically dropped the amount of drug addiction inside of China. Overall speaking, he was extremely good at his job, so good actually that he completely pissed off the British. So in response, they immediately assembled a fleet of 16 warships with 4,000 men and set sail towards the island of Zhoushan, and that was the moment everything changed. Until then, China understood that Western nations like France and Britain possessed some really advanced technologies. However, they also believed that at the end of the day, the strength and might of the Chinese Empire was simply unmatched. But reality was about to slap them in the face. Once the British Navy approached the island, the Chinese sent over their own fleet to intercept them. They fully expected them to win. But what actually happened was the complete opposite. Depending on the source, the numbers vary a little bit, but it's generally accepted that the fighting lasted roughly 10 to 15 minutes, and at the end of it, 600 to 700 Chinese soldiers were dead, and on the British side, there were exactly 0 casualties. Or in simple English, the Chinese got completely fucked. Regardless of the humiliating defeat, the Chinese still refused to give up any of their land or make any concessions to the Brits. However, after the English used an advanced persuasion tactic called bombing your cities till we get what we want, the Chinese had no choice but to agree to their demands. They agreed to pay the British back for all their destroyed opium. They also allowed more British presence inside the empire. But most importantly, they gave them a tiny rocky island in southern China. You might know it nowadays as Hong Kong. But while the First Opium War was over, both sides felt felt like they had lost the conflict. On the British side, they felt that Hong Kong was way too small to be of any importance, and they also didn't get their main demand fulfilled, which was the full legalization of opium inside of China. The Qing dynasty, on the other hand, felt that giving up any of their land, regardless of size, was completely and utterly humiliating for the nation. So it should come to you as no surprise that just a few years later, the two sides went to war again. But this time, China didn't just lose, they got decimated. Britain, along with their buddy France, got everything they wanted out of them: more trade ports, higher compensations for their destroyed opium, a larger Hong Kong, but most importantly, now Christian priests could freely enter the nation, and opium became fully legalized within the empire. Also, Russia, seeing how weak the Qing dynasty happened to be, decided to take advantage of the situation and invaded Outer Manchuria, which they hold even to this day. But while all those conflicts were taking place with foreign nations, China was having even larger problems internally: the Taiping Rebellion. I personally find this civil war extremely fascinating, but unfortunately, due to it being extremely complicated, I don't have enough time to explain it properly. However, here is an oversimplified version. So this guy's life is going terribly. He failed in his academic career and almost everything else in life. At some point, he supposedly sees a dream where he is the brother of Jesus Christ. For the next few years, he kept spreading his own version of Christianity all over China. But as the movement grew in numbers, he became more and more interested in growing his political power. The Qing, realizing that this guy might pose a threat to them, wanted him gone. At the end of the Civil War, 30 million people were dead, and much of southern China was destroyed. But aside from weakening China, this also proved to the outside world that China might not be as united as they thought. The second part that's vital for understanding this period has to do with China's neighbor, Japan. Losing to Western powers with hyper-advanced technological weapons was one thing, but what truly humiliated the Chinese people was Japan's glow-up. Just 50 years ago, Japan was exactly like China, an impoverished, underdeveloped agrarian society, but during this time, mainly because the Americans threatened to bomb the ever-living shit out of them if they didn't, the Japanese opened up their economy to the rest of the world. They bought Western weapons and products, they reshaped their military into something resembling a European nation, but most importantly, they adopted Western institutions, and the reforms were extremely successful. So successful that when Japan went to war with Russia, a literal European superpower, they somehow managed to win. From the eyes of China, Japan had always been fragile and weak, a tiny, underpopulated nation that's basically their sidekick. So when the two of them went to war in 1894, China once again drastically underestimated their opponents. They expected the Japanese to pull up in wooden ships carrying katanas. So when they came in metal ships using modern rifles, the Chinese knew they were cooked. The war was quick, and Japan won with little resistance. By the end of it, China had to give up Taiwan, Korea, and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan. While the strategic damage of losing so much land and influence was immense, the true damage was psychological. China, for a long time, thought it was the world's greatest empire. After losing to the British, they realized that wasn't true, but they hoped that they could at least be Asia's most powerful nation. After losing to the Russians, they realized they weren't even that. And now, with Japan taking so much of their land, they realized they weren't even the most powerful nation inside of their own borders. But the worst was yet to come. Russia, France, and Germany send a passive-aggressive letter to the Japanese, telling them to chill out and leave China alone. Japan, realizing that a war with 3 European nations was suicide, decided to agree and gave them back the peninsula. However, as it turns out, the Europeans didn't do it for altruistic reasons or anything crazy like that, but instead they decided to claim everything Japan gave away for themselves, which began the third stage of the story, the scramble for China. The sudden presence of Christian missionaries, foreign merchants, and even foreign diplomats inside the Chinese capital was unsurprisingly really controversial. Imagine thinking of yourself as the center of the universe and as the greatest civilization to ever exist, only to be humiliated by tiny nations you used to think of as inferior. I'm sure I'd be pissed. During this period, two main ideologies started to develop. The first one were the pragmatists. They understood that China was leaps and bounds behind the rest of the world, and the only way to compete with them was to adopt the same institutions and technologies as the Europeans. On the other hand, were the traditionalists. Their argument was simple: Chinese tradition helped us survive for well over 3,000 years, so changing our way of life is a stupid idea. At the end of the day, while some reforms were attempted and some minor adoptions of Western technology did end up happening, they weren't anywhere near enough, and China kept going down the path of tradition. One of the loudest voices of that side were the Boxers. This group was primarily composed of farmers and people in poverty that had nothing to lose and blamed the foreigners for that. They also believed that Chinese martial arts and breathing techniques were enough to take on the Western militaries. They even believed that if you concentrated properly, your body could deflect bullets, or in simple words, they were a bunch of crazy weirdos. Regardless of that, their impact on Chinese history was massive. Around 1899, after a massive drought in northern China, China caused a famine, they began the Boxer Rebellion, a short but very impactful war that saw thousands of Christian converts and foreigners get murdered. The most notable part of the conflict were the 55 days at Peking, when the diplomatic district in Peking was under siege by the Boxers and the Chinese government, which ended with these 11 nations teaming up together to save the diplomats stuck inside of the capital. China's troubles finally came to an end in 1949, after a gruesome war with Japan and a prolonged civil war between the ROC and the CCP. China was finally under control of its territory and could dictate its own future, which brings us to a very important question. Why did China undergo 100 years of humiliation? Why did Japan keep up with the Europeans, but China was unable to do the same? In all honesty, the answers to those questions are rather simple and can be broken down into 3 or 4 main points. Let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. China used to suffer from a severe case of main character disorder. They truly believed that their way of life and their civilization was simply superior to everyone else's, and because of that, they had a hard time copying the Europeans. On the other hand, Japan wasn't as delusional. They understood from the start that their tiny, underdeveloped nation had no chance in a war with a European superpower, so adapting to the new realities was the only way for them to survive. Another key difference between the two Asian nations was centralization. In Japan, Tokyo had almost universal control over the island. The moment the leadership of the nation made a decision, it was adopted all across the island instantaneously. But in China's case, the story was a little different. While Beijing was the capital, it was really hard for them to make decisions for the whole empire. Each province had its own government and laws, and oftentimes many provinces would simply ignore the central government and just do their own thing. And to make things even worse, each part of the nation used its own dialect of Chinese, which meant that simple things such as communication between them was much harder than it needed to be. If you couple those things with a very weak and outdated education system that focused on memorizing useless ancient texts instead of mathematics or engineering, and also the fact that China was exceptionally corrupt as a country, it should come to you as no surprise that the Qing dynasty completely collapsed and the nation fell into 100 years of humiliation. Anyways guys, click here to watch another video and have a great rest of your day.